Japanese.
There you go.
Oh, they were not to know that here I read. Well, blessings and peace to all of you this afternoon. Welcome. We are thrilled that you are here. We have a wonderful crowd, and they are Lord and our little rough shop. Please come in. So as we gather this afternoon, I want to say to you that I offer special thoughts for our friend David because he has to be just exhausted. I just told him, I said, David, you have to be tired because I just woke up. Somehow, all night, all asleep. And we woke up at 10 o'clock. So, David, blessings to you, friend. He has to call him, so he'll keep going. We are thankful for this time to gather, and I want to remind you that tomorrow morning we will gather as well. This will be the final session, but tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, Tom Murray is making his famous Connie's biscuits, and we will come. Yeah.
Isn't it 8:30?
8:30.
Is it 8:30? Let's do it with it. It's at 8:30. Okay, all right. Okay. 8:30 in the morning, so all are welcome. That will be our time to come together with David, and it's just an informal room sitting right out here on the stool, and we'll fire questions at him, so you can think all night about what you might need to ask him, and we'll just have an informal time with him and share good history, and then offer prayers for him to send him on his way. So if you're available in the morning, come and share the special experience with us. So I'm looking, Carrie Sue is out.
She's en route.
Pardon me.
She's coming.
She's with children. So I'm checking to see, do we have any other clergy? We have Bishop Bill with us this evening. All right. He's so alive.
I will not be in the part of the Q&A session.
Friends, let us pray, and then I'm going to invite our friend Jack to come and formally introduce David. Pray. Oh God, God, what you do today. You have blessed us with the gift of our new friend David, and we thank you so much for that. And we pray now that you will be present in his heart as he comes to share with us once again. We pray, God, that you will open our minds and spirits to hear what you have to say. As David comes, may your hand be upon him, and you give him wisdom and grace. But most of all, God, continue to love him as only you can. We pray this in the wonderful name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Roger. Good afternoon. Whenever I'm in a meeting, people have a hard time figuring out what I reminds me of a meeting that Ron saw many years ago when we had a very self-recognizing speaker. They had been. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
All I hear is an echo. Does anybody else hear an echo? Only one person, all I hear is an echo.
Nobody else hears it.
I do.
Happens to all.
All right.
Must be something.
I'll continue. But I don't want to get here today. Maybe I'll stand away from the microphone. Anyway, the Lions Club, we had a speaker Friday notice, and after that, but nobody really paying attention, and finally, about 10 minutes, he went, can you all hear me in the back? I'm not sure I can hear myself. And one of the old fellows, sometimes old folks' tables, yelled out, don't worry, you're not missing anything. And looking around the room, I don't see anybody that hasn't been here before, so I'm not going to take up y'all's time, my time, to get a long introduction of faith. We know those credentials, and we're. I want to take a minute to brag on our church's continuous involvement in this late academy preaching, teaching, now Let's Shine program, because through the big years of attendance and the thin years of attendance, it's wonderful to see it back up again this year. It is a wonderful opportunity for our congregation to hear some of the great minds in religious thought. I'm sorry, again, this is an example of just Methodist. But maybe some of y'all, of course, we have Ron, Bill, and other ministers in our congregation, but I always kind of want to go to seminary. But yeah, I have heard a call. Maybe there's a good reason for that. But as I said, I really have enjoyed the opportunity to hear some of these theologians come into us and get to understand from their point of view some great thinking and reading and involvement. So I just want to commend the church and all the community presence is something that we can't really take for granted. I mean, we either show up or we don't show up. That's on Sunday morning. We really have presence. I just want to say, David, thanks to your great contributions, I think you helped us spur this Let's Shine Academy on. But the last thing I want to say is that as far as taking advantage of people like David, this is something I'll say this. But 50 years ago, close I came to those seminaries, I took the Old Testament class at my senior year as a lecturer. And one of the teachers at the seminary that came over and taught this to us undergraduate. It was a semester on the book of Job. Because my daughter was said when she was with the First Baptist girl, there was a tornado warning in our house, and this little teenage girl, her grade, and she was in her First Baptist. She said, Mr. Jack, let's think I'll read the Bible. And I said, well, sure, Margaret, that will make you feel better. Yes, I'll read the Bible. I said, you read it? She said, oh, Kirk read it. So Kirk opened it up and said, the book of John. But the tornado did not hit us. But anyway, I want to say after 50 years of writing this Bible, and many of these comments in my Bible are from late academies. I collected this book, and as Angelica said in Hamilton to Thomas Jefferson, if there's a sequel and us women to create equal, then if I write a sequel, you will have a lot of pages in this book. So happy home today.
Basic rule for speakers: never follow the funniest man. That's just something we don't do. So it's been great. Y'all take care. Thanks. Well, I am astonished to see this crowd today. There are some things to do in Tupelo, right? I mean, it's cold, and here you are. And I really feel appreciative. Now, it may help that our announced topics today are two things you're not supposed to talk about in church: politics and sex. So, both of those things are on the agenda for this afternoon, which may explain why so many of you are here. Actually, how this came together, I mean, I mentioned earlier that the idea was to do a kind of a drop down on various issues that I've worked on. And for this last session, there was kind of a choice. Do I talk about the democracy book, or do I talk about the LGBT inclusion book? And we just decided that I'd talk about both. And so what I'm going to do is have kind of two sessions this afternoon, a bonus round for you. And so it's 4:15. The first session will go till about 5, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. And then if you want to leave, there's no shame in it. If you want to stay, we'll then have a second session, and that will end no later than 6, okay? And then we'll be done, if that's all right. So, bonus round, the same fee that you're paying to come here covers all of these sessions, okay? So, one other thought. If you were here this morning, the work that I've done on moral teachings of Jesus, on the Beatitudes, in one sense, is completely uncontroversial. What's hard about it is that it asks a lot of us, right? So, but it's kind of, there isn't anybody who's going to come into a lecture about the teachings of Jesus and say, I'm against it. If they're Christians, they might say, that's too hard. I don't love the demands, but they're going to respect it. I'm afraid that in these 2 sessions, there may be some things that people disagree with that you might not like, you might find controversial or unpleasant, and I hope that we will be able to remain in a good spirit together, a good Christian community, good fellowship, and if there are disagreements, that we can have civil disagreement, which is part of what we need to learn how to do anyway, right? So, here we go. So I wrote a book in 2023 that had the rather provocative title, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And this is a talk that is based on that book, but that broadens the conversation to a broader analysis. So I want to talk about what Christians have at stake in relating to 2 problems that are connected but not identical. One is the problem of radical polarization in politics, where people disagree utterly with one another and consider the other side a threat to the nation and a threat to democracy sometimes. And the other problem is the weakening of what I call liberal democratic norms and the rise of illiberal or anti-liberal authoritarian governments with Christian support. So, a lot of what people ask me to do as a Christian ethicist is they'll say, can you help me understand what is going on in our country right now? If you have ever wanted anybody to answer that question for you, well, that person's not available, but I'm here, and I will try to answer that question by the end of this talk. What is going on? Why are we so divided? Why does everything seem to be in crisis? I'm going to tell you a story that is my effort to account for where we are. So, let's begin 70 years ago with the beginning of dramatic social changes that evoked a movement, or actually, that evoked a movement of Christian support for social change that can be described as the religious left or religious liberalism. What I'm saying is that American society began to change dramatically in the 1950s, and some of those changes were partly motivated by Christian beliefs, and many of the changes were supported by what began to coalesce as a kind of a religious left or progressive religious vision. So let your mind drift back to the mid to late 1950s. It's easier for some of you than for others, you know. But maybe if all you have is the history books, just think of that that reader of history or civics that you read in school. If you think about, say, 1953 or 1952, let's think about that as a kind of Eisenhower's America. In an America that many people remember as having a kind of a broad cultural, religious, and moral consensus. It was the era of the Cold War. It was the era where there was a kind of a resurgence of public Christianity. Pledge of Allegiance had God language added, and God we trust was added to our coins. And it was so picture that as a kind of baseline starting point. Some things began to change. And I'll start the story with Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954. As you know, this was the decision that required that public schools throughout the country be desegregated. This was the product of long, hard labors by brilliant lawyers such as Thurgood Marshall and organizations such as the NAACP. The Brown versus Board of Education decision initiated a ferocious cultural fight, or you might say intervened in the long-standing pattern of segregation and initiated a major desegregation fight that we tend to call the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement also took a major lead that year with the Montgomery bus boycott. And the leadership of that movement in Montgomery fell to a young 25-year-old minister named Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So 1954 can be seen as a launching point for social change towards what many of us would say was now to be a more just, a more fair, and a more inclusive society. So let's start there. Moving into the early 1960s, the next step in the story that I want to tell is when the Supreme Court voted to ban school-sponsored prayer and Bible reading. Some of you may remember those days. And the reason this was done in these two Supreme Court decisions was out of deference to religious liberty concerns on the part of atheists and people of minority religions. Of course, as you probably know, what would happen in public schools is that generally the teachers or the principals would articulate prayers or teach the Bible on the basis of their faith. And that would be perfectly comfortable for parents and kids who shared that faith, but for parents and kids who did not share the faith, it was seen as not very comfortable. In fact, even an environment that was not fair for their child or a violation of the separation of church and state. Well, some of these cases went to the Supreme Court, and the court agreed that there should be a stricter separation of church and state in the public schools. This decision came as a shock to many conservative Christians and conservative, especially Southern, but not only Southern communities. But there were religious people who supported these decisions, not just Jews and Muslims and Catholics and Protestant communities and Protestants and Catholic communities, but people who felt that yes, the public schools should not be the environment in which children were being instructed in religion. But of course, this initiated conflict as well that never really went away. In 1965, the third step in my story, an immigration reform law was passed that opened immigration to the U.S. Quite radically. It ended quotas that since the 1920s had officially favored Northern and Western Europeans for entry into the United States, and explicitly discriminated against Asians, Africans, and Southern and Eastern Europeans. It led, the new immigration reform law led to a massive rise in immigration, indeed from the global South, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Over the ensuing decades, this has changed the religious and ethnic makeup of the United States, so that we are a much more multi-hued nation, a much less white nation, and a much more religiously diverse nation. In general, religious liberals supported this immigration reform, as opening up America to be a more fair and inclusive society, whereas more conservative folks tended to be opposed to it. Also in the 1960s, the women's rights movement picked up steam in a new wave of what is sometimes called second wave feminism. Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, was pivotal. The National Organization of Women was founded. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned sex discrimination in employment. Women entered the workforce in much larger numbers. The idea that society should be dominated by men and that marriage involved subordination of women was challenged and it seemed to have been largely defeated by the 1980s and 1990s. Religious liberals tended to strongly support the women's rights movement and the social changes that this created. One of the more controversial fruits of the women's movement was the national legalization of abortion in 1973 in Roe v. Wade. This decision was the result of careful strategizing on the part of the women's movement. The three-trimester paradigm for adjudicating when abortion would be permitted was debated. Even some people who were pro-choice didn't think that the three-trimester model made sense. But in the end, that was what the Supreme Court decided on. And so for 50 years, the federal courts had overridden state laws that were more conservative, and there was national access to abortion. The overall idea that women, and women only, should have the right to determine whether to end their pregnancies was widely and never universally accepted, and became the principle of the law. Abortion was more controversial among religious progressives. Some were more cautious about abortion and didn't identify it as the same as they did other causes as being morally unambiguous. But in general, the religious left tended to be in favor of the Roe v. Wade decision. Also, the sexual revolution spread during this 1960s and 1970s period. Women's empowerment was part of it, but so was a general loosening up of sexual mores, a delinking of sex and marriage, and the availability of safe and effective birth control at a mass level. You know, it took Supreme Court decisions, which are largely forgotten now, for the birth control pill to be accepted as being available, and then a different decision for it to be available to unmarried people. Divorce rates doubled between 1964 and 1975, and in general, marriage, the number of people marrying gradually declined, and the number of people divorcing gradually declined too, but still it was much more than it did before that period. Eventually, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people began demanding equal access to employment, to housing, to civil and human rights, and eventually to marriage. This was a much longer fight that appeared to culminate in 2015 when the conservative Supreme Court under John Roberts offered its Obergefell decision, which legalized gay marriage. In so doing, it also overturned all state laws which had banned it in different states. In general, religious liberals were supportive of the gay rights movement, of the loosening of divorce laws, and more freedom for people to choose their own path in terms of their sexual relationships, though there was some concern that the loosening of sexual morality was also having some negative effects too, such as the rise in unplanned pregnancies. Then there was the attack on poverty and economic injustice that was a priority, especially for Lyndon Johnson's administration in the mid-60s, symbolized by the Great Society program. Much of what Johnson wanted to do never fell off the ground or failed, but still the 1960s saw the establishment of two programs we now depend on in our millions, Medicare and Medicaid. Religious liberals tended to be in favor of government intervention in the economy to provide greater access to health care, senior citizen support, and social support for the poor. The Vietnam War, some of you well remember how the Vietnam War drove a terrible wedge in U.S. society with opposition growing beginning, I'd say, by the mid-1960s. And religious liberals tended to be definitively against the Vietnam War, to be among the marchers in the streets. Meanwhile, fear of nuclear annihilation in the US-Soviet Cold War was realistic. And everybody who lives with the Cuban Missile Crisis will remember how close we got in 1962. Religious liberals positioned themselves in general in opposition to the Vietnam War and in support of gradual nuclear disarmament and a turn away from nuclear confrontation. And then finally, scientific alarm about environmental distress intensified during the same period. A key thing, well, when you started seeing lakes catching on fire because of the toxins in the water, that was rather a warning. But there was also a famous book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring in 1962. Government policymakers began debating and passing all kinds of environmental laws on a bipartisan basis, generally. The first Earth Day was in 1970. Scientists shortly after that began warning about climate change. And religious progressives tended to be very strongly in support of environmentalism. By the way, my father worked for the Congressional Research Service in the 60s and 70s, and his proudest accomplishment was helping to draft briefing documents for Congress to help them pass these laws. And so we talk about these kind of things around our kitchen table at our house. So, looking at all of this, from 1954 forward, the Civil Rights Movement, the school prayer decisions, immigration reform, the women's rights movement, abortion, the sexual revolution, expansion of government intervention in the economy, opposition to the Vietnam War, the nuclear freeze, the nuclear disarmament movement, and the environmental movement. So what I'm saying is we have substantial social and policy change, governmental change under Democratic leadership generally during this period, with progressive Christians and other religious and secular people generally in favor. So that's the story so far. But also, in response to these changes and to the religious progressive movement, the Christian right was born. There always had been a Christian conservative strain in American politics, sometimes more or less active, sometimes more disengaged from politics, but mobilized by these social changes, the Christian right began to pick up steam and to move into political involvement. And so, pretty much everything that happened that the religious progressives were for, religious conservatives and other conservatives were against. Maybe more directly, maybe more obliquely. So, for example, the civil rights movement was largely opposed by fundamentalists and right-wing preachers who said that God's design was that the races should be segregated, or said that the state should have no business interfering on racial relations in our country, or in setting policies that would apply to private business or communities. And so, where the religious right activism tended to be especially strong here was to try to get the state to support private Christian schools and tax breaks for them, and to not require that they adhere to the desegregation laws that were applicable to the public schools. The school prayer, if you remember anything about that period, the school prayer decisions were met with extraordinary outrage in the early 1960s. The idea that the liberal judges had voted God out of the public schools was a very strong theme during this period. The Supreme Court was seen as a great enemy and as having unnecessarily intervened in the values of local communities, telling them that they could not do prayers or teach the Bible in school, and that is what 97% of people in the community wanted to be able to do. And so part of how the religious right got its start was in opposing the school prayer and Bible reading in school decisions in the early 1960s. As for this should be the immigration, I don't know why it's not on the slide, but I would say this, the immigration law that opened America to people from lots of other nations and with lots of other religions was met generally with caution and with opposition on the right side of the spectrum, though it hasn't been universal. But in general, since that period, and certainly in recent times, the idea that America should be preserved as a Christian nation, and even as a predominantly white Christian nation, has been resurging in recent years. So the idea that we are a dramatically multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation has not been met with support on the Christian right. As for the gender, sexuality, and family issues, these tend to be featured very heavily on the Christian right side. The women's rights movement was seen by many on the right as an assault on the God-given order of gender relations. The Christian right positioned itself as in opposition to the women's movement, was opposed to the equal rights movement, and has tended to say that the Christianity teaches as part of its doctrine a male-led social order. You may have heard of recent voices in the last few years who are articulating these views with surprising breadth of support. Views such as the idea that women should no longer be allowed to vote, or that household heads who are men should cast a vote for the family. Let the women consult with the husband at home, and then the man will cast the vote. There are conservative pastors with massive social media followings, his name is Doug Wilson out in Idaho, who teaches us and have a wide following. It's gone a long way past the idea that maybe women shouldn't be allowed to be pastors, which I talked about yesterday in my story. Here are people who are trying to roll back pretty much every advance for women since the amendment that allowed women to vote in the early 20th century. As for abortion, you know, if you've been paying any attention, that abortion became the single most visible issue on the Christian right. The Christian right was able to grow and mobilize a constituency by saying that the most important voting issue is to overturn access to abortion. And because abortion had been legalized nationally by a Supreme Court decision, from 1978 until 2023, the single strongest appeal of the Christian right was elect Republican presidents who will appoint Supreme Court justices who will overturn Roe v. Wade. And for decades, it looked like it was going to be like, Lucy and Charlie Brown, you know, the football's there, and there's going to be a kick, and she's going to pull the football out. But in, 2023 or 2024, the football was kicked, and Roe v. Wade was overturned, and now we get back to state-by-state regulation of abortion, which was one of the major goals. But it is my understanding that still the conservative Christian right is not satisfied with the results and wants more restrictions. As for the sexual revolution, the Christian right has always been opposed to the sexual revolution. It's continued to teach not just that sex belongs in marriage, but that it must be between a man and a woman. The attack on poverty and economic injustice has generally been opposed by the Christian right, which has tended to embrace more libertarian and small government politics. Though there have been evangelicals who've been supportive of some of these government interventions and social service programs, in general, as the parties have polarized, this has been another aspect of the polarization. As for the issues of peace and war, while there were for a while evangelicals who were peace activists, opposed to Vietnam, opposed to nuclear weapons, in general, the kind of pro-military, anti-Vietnam protester types tended to gravitate to the right, and so a kind of a more conservative, pro-military, pro-nation, pro-strong U.S. intervention in the world thing tended to coalesce on the side of the right. And as for environmental distress, while for a while, there were conservative Christians who were concerned about the environment. This issue has also polarized, so that in general, environmental concern goes to the left, and a desire to protect, the existing state of affairs and to deny the significance of environmental problems has gone to the right. So this is 60 years of fighting. 60 years of fighting between left and right over a wide range of issues. It's a little messier than the summary that I've given you, but I think it's a pretty decent summary. I would say that for 60 years, these competing visions have been battling it out in religious communities and in the public square. I've spent my 30-year career in the middle of some of these fights on environment, on economic life, on human rights, and so on women's rights. It's been challenging, it's been exhausting, but it has until recently occurred within the recognizable boundaries of religious community and democratic deliberation. What I mean is that while it hasn't been fun, it wasn't fun to have these arguments all the time. We knew what the rules were, and we contested these arguments within the rules of our denominations and within the rules of democratic deliberation. You had debates in churches and denominations. You had votes, and somebody won and somebody lost, and there were results and consequences, but there was a democratic process, and the results of the democratic process were respected. Let's call this the era of polarization within liberalism. By liberalism here, I mean within the boundaries of long-standing institutions like Congress and courts and democratic structures within, or at least representative structures within denominations like the United Methodist Church. So a lot of what I was trained to do was to help Christians think about such issues and to make good arguments and to participate as good citizens, as good legislators, and as good participants in denominations in these conversations. But I think something new has been developing that has changed the context in which we find ourselves, and I call it the rise of illiberalism. Okay? So let's define illiberalism. Illiberalism. You have a new phrase, you can try it on your friends. Post-liberalism would also work. Illiberalism sounds like you're sick, which is actually true, right? Illiberalism. When a liberal democracy gets ill. A political movement that undermines liberal democratic principles. The hollowing out of existing liberal democracy from within. People turn to illiberalism when they feel that liberal democracy isn't protecting their identity, their security, their prosperity, or their values. And when ambitious leaders seize the mood of anger and despair to win power, they can often do so at the expense of democracy itself. I think this is where we are now. We are in, and this is not just me, it's widely shared analysis, we are at least at a moment where our American liberal democracy is at risk of turning into an illiberal post-democracy. But we're so polarized that we can't even agree on who is responsible for the rise of illiberalism. Even people who agree that we're in an illiberal moment don't agree on who's at fault. So I'll tell you what I have said, but then I'll also tell you what the other side says. Okay? What I have said, the story I have told, is that the primary problem is a frustrated Christian right that, after decades of being unsatisfied with their involvement in democratic activism, has proven susceptible to illiberal authoritarianism. And the reason for the support for Donald Trump is that he has been willing to say, I will help you win this game, you'll just have to let me change some of the rules of the game. We will win. You will win like never before if you support me. what this movement of people who are criticized for this authoritarian and illiberal turn, they're usually called Christian nationalists. I don't love that vocabulary. In my book, like the easy, memorable phrase, authoritarian, reactionary Christianity. See how it's not as easy as Christian nationalism? But ARC can be remembered. In fact, in the book I say, authoritarian, reactionary Christianity, ARC, seeks to bend the arc of history backwards to about 1952. There are a lot of people in America that would really like to go back to 1952, or 1922, or 1892, or even 1842. And if they are confronted by the stubborn existence of about 48 or 52 or 56% of the people or 70% of the people who don't want to go back to 1952, 1932, or 1872, they are willing to bend the democratic rules to win because they think their cause is just. So my concern is that illiberalism and the intentional weakening of democratic rules of the game, norms, even, the proper role of Congress, limits on executive authority, the use of our military and police forces, some of the things we're seeing in the streets are all the result of a liberalism in power with the perceived mandate to win the victories against these social changes by any means necessary. So the concern is the consolidation of an authoritarian government at the federal level that will overturn a 250-year-old democracy. So that's how I've been telling the story. And I'm right, so that takes care of that. Right? But if you would like to hear the other side of the story, because I'm trying to be fair, I'll say this. On the right, their claim is that the problem is that the liberals have been illiberal. The problem is that the progressives, the more left-leaning people, have been doing their own kind of authoritarianism, just cultural and academic authoritarianism. The argument was articulated by New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, who said essentially this, that the managerial class in Western democracies, that would be business leaders, political leaders, educational leaders, judges, civil servants, and bureaucrats, have been attempting to enforce a liberal agenda on the whole of society, whether people want it or not, and without actually a robust democratic debate. And so, in state universities, the kids are being taught gender ideology, and in Hollywood, all kinds of liberal/radical values are being promoted, and the judges are passing laws like you can't have prayers in school, and there's going to be abortion on demand, even though most of the states didn't want it. And so that what is happening now, according to this vision, is that the conservative side is simply pushing back. That they are simply trying to level the playing field, but that because they believe the left has already been illiberal, they may need to be illiberal to win. But this story also helps to explain why there is an effort right now to kind of clip the wings of a number of sectors of society that tend to be progressive leaning. So how would you do that? Well, you would maybe intimidate academics about what they're teaching. And maybe you would threaten independent media with lawsuits. And maybe you would tell the civil service to cut it and gut it like in Washington, and then say, if you are not with this program, we're going to get rid of you. Or maybe you would gut certain agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development because it's seen as a bearer of liberal values. And maybe you would either try to buy off or intimidate or seduce the high-flying business community to get them with you as well. In other words, you seize the commanding heights of culture, business, economics, media, civil service, the judges, all the way academia, all the way across the board. Meanwhile, you use government power to do that. And meanwhile, maybe you can therefore turn the clock back and roll back some of these unfortunate changes. So that's their claim, that elite-driven cultural change, at least as far back perhaps as Brown versus Board of Education, but certainly the Supreme Court decisions of the early 60s, bureaucratic coercion of ordinary people just trying to live their lives, and that this means that democratic legitimacy has already been undermined by the left, and so they just have to play just as hard on the right and take back the country. What I can say is this. Whatever we can say about who's at fault, I think we're in a mutual death spiral right now. The two sides are in such polarity that we are constantly pointing the finger at each other and saying, it's your fault, no, 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 it's your fault. We are mirroring each other in our mutual antipathy. Maybe you've been in a conversation where you've heard something like this: those liberals are the enemies of America, or those conservatives are the enemies of democracy. Families are breaking along these lines. I have two surviving sisters who can't speak to each other because they are occupying these two different areas. There are juvenile levels of finger pointing and mutual blaming. Mutual incomprehension runs very high and very hot. Mutual loathing. We also, because of the algorithms of our social media feeds, we are constantly fed our own narrative. If you watch Fox News all day, or news channels to the right of that, and have an active social media feed of that similar type, you are having people tell you that all day long. But if you also watch, MS Now is called now, and media feeds along those lines, TikTok videos, Instagram, Reels, whatever, constantly feeding off of our mutual antagonism and making it mutually worse. It's pathological, and in fact, there are reasonable people who are concerned that our society will simply tear and collapse in violence. And there are signs of political violence rising. So what do we do? Well, I don't have great answers, so I'll end here. First, I would say, instead of just pointing fingers at the other side, if you believe in something in terms of moral values or political opinion, make the best and the most principled case for it, day by day. Tell your own story, make your own best argument. And if you are motivated fundamentally by religious principles or biblical teachings or the example of Jesus, say that. The reason I think immigrants should be treated with respect is because God says we're all made in God's image. That's why I'm against this or that. The reason I think that everybody who has a badge and a gun we should have to be able to see their face and they should be subject to judicial review is because nobody should have absolute power. And the reason nobody should have absolute power is because human beings are sinful. And so everybody needs to be checked. In other words, there are deep ways to make arguments about things that are not just, nah, you're evil, but instead, here is what I believe and here is why. So, make the best principled case that you can, and then model your own values, model integrity, model justice. Secondly, act according to the democratic principles enshrined in our Constitution. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Act to protect both the freedom of the church and the freedom of the state. Act to protect individuals whose freedom of speech is threatened and institutions of culture. Be an American. Protect American values. And then finally, try to reject any illiberalism that may be creeping in on your side, your view, your team. Watch out for just demonizing the other side. Try to retain relationships where possible. Respect the free expression of ideas you don't agree with. I remember the masthead of the Jackson Sun used to say, the quote from Voltaire, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." That's a liberal value statement, and that is freedom of expression. I used to write a weekly column in the Jackson Sun up in Tennessee, and when I would see people in the town, I would get 2 responses. One was, "I love your column." The other was, "Oh, you're the guy who writes the paper." But nobody told me I had to stop. And even the people who disagreed with me would dialogue with me. That's a free society. So respect civil discourse and practice it. Give good reason for your views. Respect democratic norms like honoring the results of elections. Reject any form of political coercion and violence. Acknowledge that we are, for the foreseeable future, a divided and diverse society, and that the other 40% or so are not going away. Whatever side your 40% is, or 20 or 10. So we have to learn to bear with each other. This passage from Colossians 3 comes to mind. Beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving each other. We have to learn how to bear with one another. We share a society of people with whom we fundamentally disagree, and we will do so until the day is done. We have to learn how to bear with each other. I think the greatest need at this present moment for Christian engagement in public life is to practice bearing with one another. To have a really painful, unhappy conversation and not write somebody off. Be ready to have a different one on a different day. To remain in community. I can also say this, there is a great sorting going on where, for example, Republicans and Democrats often cannot be in the same room together anymore. The disdain is so high. If this is a church where Republicans and Independents and Democrats can be in the same community and love each other, you're actually making a contribution to this society. Protect that space. Don't make political affiliation a test of Christian community. Stay in community with each other. Any space where we have to relate to people who vote differently for us and then have to love them is a really important space right now. So let First United Methodist Church be that. We don't need more to-the-wall culture warriors. We need more love and more forbearance. I'll leave it there. So thank you all very much.